Good, we can start.
Okay, so let me introduce you. It's always been my duty. That. Okay, so shall we start, Saurabh?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. Yeah, so good morning to all of you and welcome to this exciting workshop on number theory. As you know, there will be 4 mini courses, one by Professor Balasubramaniam on the Riemann-Zeta function, and then Surya Ramana will speak on probabilistic number theory. Stefan Bayer will speak on sieve methods and bounded gaps between primes, and Burma will speak on automorphic representation. So while the first 3 are like core topics in analytic and combinatorial number theory, the last topic, the automorphic forms, may seem to many of you to be rather esoteric for such a gathering. But I personally believe that the theory of automorphic forms, not just that of GL2, but even for higher rank automorphic forms, is the theory essential in the road ahead for analytic number theorists. And the analytic number theorists will do well by learning the basics of this theory. So thanks to the organizers for including this in this workshop. Now my pleasant duty is to introduce the first speaker, who really doesn't need any introduction. But anyway, so Professor Balasubramaniam has worked in analytic and combinatorial number theory for more than 45 years. He is known all over the world for his fantastic work on Waring problem, also for his work on circle method, Riemann-Zeta function, and combinatorial number theory. And so the organizers has asked me to tell you that if you have any question during the course, please write it in the chat or raise your hand. And if you have any other questions, you can also email to the organizers, and they will either communicate with the speaker or they will reply back to you. So without much ado, let me request Balu to take the stage. Balu?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
You are able to see my video, no?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, fine. First of all, thank the organizers for this opportunity. And in fact, I was always, and thanks also Hitapisa for a nice introduction. And I always felt that some of the results of Ramachandra are not that well known as they should be. And this actually gave me a good opportunity to talk about some of the results of Ramachandra. Therefore, the first lecture I will be talking about introduction and classical results is something which I may be go a little fast. But on the other hand, I won't be able to see the chat, but I think if there's any question in the chat, probably the organizers will be able to see and tell me so that I can answer them.
Yes.
And in the second, third, and fourth lectures, I will be talking about some results from Ramachandra School. By Ramachandra School, I mean the paper articles written by Ramachandra or Ramachandra and some of his students like Shankar Narayan, or the papers which were written by the students alone. Therefore, we start with the definition of a Riemann-Zeta function. Yeah, I really, since I cannot see the audience, I really do not know the level of the audience, and therefore I may be going a little fast or I may be going a little slow. And in either case, you please tell me so that I can go at the appropriate stage. Therefore, as usual in number theory, S equal to sigma plus it is a complex number, and zeta s is defined by sigma n equal to 1 to infinity 1 over n power s. This is absolutely and uniformly convergent in sigma bigger than 1. I mean, uniformly convergent in every compact subset of sigma bigger than 1. And there it depends on analytic function. And this has an order product also. Zeta s is equal to product over p, 1 minus 1 over p power s inverse. And that is actually, in fact, one of the reasons why number theorists are interested in studying the function, because on the one hand, you have a sum. The sum is over all natural numbers. On the other hand, there's a product. This product is over primes. Therefore, one feels that it may be possible to translate the information from the set of natural numbers to the set of numbers. More generally, you suppose you have f to be a multiplicative function. By multiplicative function, I mean f of mn equal to fm into fn whenever mn and n are co-prime. For such a function, again, you can write an Euler product. The Euler product will look like summation fn by n power s equal to product over p, 1 plus fp by p power s plus fp square by p power 2s plus fp cubed by p power 3s, etc. And you may wonder why there is a difference between these two sides. One side just a product of only one term with an inverse, and here. That is essentially because the function which we are considering there, namely the function f of n equal to identically 1, is just not only multiplicative, it is completely multiplicative. What does that mean? That means f of mn equal to f of m into f of n for every value of m and n. In that case, of course, an Euler product which you have seen earlier, that is still true. Summation fn by n power s equal to product over p, 1 minus fp by p power s inverse. Yeah, the first question is why to study the zeta function. As I was telling earlier, this Euler product connects the zeta function to primes, and therefore you can, that's the only important reason for us to study. But there are other important reasons to study, namely that every arithmetic function, every nice arithmetic function that you would come across is associated with the zeta function in one way or the other. For example, zeta square s equal to summation dn by n power s, where dn is a divisor function. And first of all, how does one prove results of this type? Results of the type that is zeta square s equal to summation dn by n power s. The one thing is that both sides are multiplicative. The coefficients are multiplicative. Therefore, both sides have Euler product. Since both sides have Euler product, therefore you can write the Euler product. Therefore, it is sufficient to check by prime. And therefore, the zeta square s, the Euler product is 1 minus 1 over p power s power minus 2. And the right hand side, as we have written, the Euler product is 1 plus dp by p power s plus dp square by p power 2s plus dp cubed by p power 3s, etc. And dp equal to 2, dp square equal to 3, dp cubed equal to 4, and therefore this is a binomial expansion. And this is how most of the other statements we are mentioning we will prove, essentially saying that both sides are multiplicative function, both sides have Euler product, and therefore you have to just check it for prime by prime. And the zeta s, if you raise to the power k, then that will be summation dkn by n power s. And the normal divisor function is d2n, namely the number of ways of writing n as a1 times a2, that is dn, d2n, that is dn. And dkn is the number of ways of writing n as a1 times a2 times a3 times etc. ak. In how many ways you can write n as a product of k integers? That is what your zeta k power s is. And then zeta s into zeta s minus a, if you look at it, summation sigma a n by n power s, where sigma a n is you take all the divisors of n and then raise them to the nth power and then sum it up. And sigma 1 n is normally what is called sigma n. It is summation d dividing n, d summation over d. And zeta s minus 1 by zeta s if you take, and that is summation phi n by n power s. The phi n is a standard Euler function. And as you see, therefore, the standard functions which you come across, your arithmetic functions, like your dn or phi n or sigma n, etc., all are related to the Riemann zeta function. And therefore, by studying this Riemann zeta function, you would be in a position to study all these arithmetic functions. But one of the important arithmetic functions which we need is logarithm of zeta s, which is summation lambda n by n power s, where lambda n equal to 1 over m if n is from p power m and it is 0 otherwise. And you can check that actually how does one prove this log zeta s equal to summation lambda n by n power s? In order to prove that, you use the fact that the zeta function has an Euler product. Since zeta function has one, therefore there's a zeta function can be written as a product, and therefore each logarithm is a sum, and then you do the sum, and then you will get sigma lambda n by n power s. And this is not particularly useful for arithmetic applications. This is not particularly useful essentially because one would like to, for arithmetic applications, one would like to study the zeta function in the neighborhood of s equal to 1. But in the neighborhood of s equal to 1, log zeta s has a logarithmic singularity. And if you have a function which has a logarithmic singularity, it is somewhat difficult to study the function. The easiest thing which one does is essentially differentiate it. When you differentiate, you get a minus zeta prime s over zeta s, which is summation capital lambda n by n power s. And capital lambda n, of course, when you differentiate it, you will get capital lambda n is nothing but little lambda n times the logarithm of n. And if you write what is little lambda n times logarithm of n, you will get capital lambda n is the logarithm of p if n is from p power m and 0 otherwise. And this is one more important thing which I want to say. This is due to Ramanujan. Zeta s into zeta s minus a into zeta s minus b into zeta s minus a minus b divided by zeta of 2s minus a minus b equal to summation sigma an sigma bn by n power s. And if I am going to talk about essentially results of Ramachandra, this is something which he used is also important, but since I don't have time in these 4 lectures, I may not be able to talk much on that. But except for the fact, this gives a corollary. A is equal to I alpha and B is equal to minus I alpha. If you take A equal to I alpha, then you get a zeta square s into zeta s minus I alpha into zeta s plus I alpha by divided by zeta 2s, which is summation sigma I alpha n mod square divided by n power s. The importance of this is a theorem of Ingham, who proved the non-vanishing of the zeta function on the one line without using anything like a 3 plus 4 cos theta plus cos 2 theta greater than or equal to 0. I mean, most of the standard proofs which you would have seen is start with the fact that 3 plus 4 cos theta plus cos 2 theta greater than or equal to 0, and then somehow they connect the value of zeta 1 plus it with the value of zeta 1 plus 2it, and then say that if zeta 1 plus it equal to 0, then zeta 1 plus 2it is a 4, but we know zeta 1 plus 2it is not a 4, and therefore zeta 1 plus it is not equal to 0. But without using any such 3 plus 4 cos theta, directly only arguing with zeta 1 plus it and using this identity, Ingham was able to prove that zeta function does not vanish on the line 1. But in his paper, he makes a comment that on the other hand, if you need probably a lower bound for zeta 1 plus it on the one line, then it might be a good idea to go back to the classical proof rather than this Ramanujan's identity, because Ramanujan's identity gives that it is not equal to 0, but it does not give a decent lower bound for zeta 1 plus it. And that is what Ramachandra proved. In fact, one can get a decent lower bound for zeta 1 plus it starting from Ramanujan's identity. And probably there was a number theory conference arranged by IMSC only around 10 days back, where there was a lecture by Ramare where this was mentioned, and there was also a lecture by Peter Sarnak where it was mentioned. And therefore, in case those who are interested probably can look at those articles. And the next thing which we want is Perron formula. You see, all of you know what is this Cauchy theorem on residues. The theorem says that if you have an analytic function f of z equal to summation an z power n equal to 0 to infinity, which is valid in mod z less than or equal to 2, then the coefficients an can be written as an integral involving f of z. Namely, more precisely, an equal to 1 over 2 pi I integral over mod z equal to 1 fz by z power n plus 1 dz. That is, you integrate over a circle, and the circle should be completely lying within the circle of convergence of the function fz. And once it lies within the circle of convergence of the fz, you can integrate the function, and then you can get actually the coefficients. This turns out to be very important, and in fact, this actually is one thing which gives a great advantage to complex analysis compared to real analysis, because in real analysis, this an can be expressed in terms of fz only as a derivative, not as an integral. And once you express it as an integral, there are many advantages. And the corresponding theorem for complex analysis is a so-called Perron formula. The Perron formula says that if for technical reasons, we will take x to be always an integer plus half. Therefore, if x is equal to an integer plus half, and suppose you have a function fs, which is summation an by n power s, and let us assume that it is absolutely convergent in sigma bigger than 1. Therefore, if you have a function fs, which is sigma an by n power s, which is absolutely convergent to sigma bigger than 1, then summation an equal to 1 over 2 pi I integral f of s x power s by s ds. This is a very, very important formula. And in fact, as you can see, unlike in the case of Cauchy's theorem, this actually gives you not a single coefficient an, but the summatory coefficient. And the summatory coefficient thing is precisely what we would be interested in most of our applications. In most of our applications, we will be needing only sigma an, and that is given by an integral. This formula, even though it's a very important formula, we will never use it. The reason why we will never use this important formula is simply because this integral on the right-hand side is convergent, but not absolutely convergent. And if we have an integral which is convergent and not absolutely convergent, then it is very difficult to handle the integral. You cannot interchange the integrals, you cannot do anything with that, etc. And therefore, in spite of the importance of this theorem, we will never use it. What we will do is a certain variance of this theorem, where the corresponding integral is in fact an absolutely convergent integral. And once it's absolutely convergent integral, then of course you have no problem at all. You can just write down the integration and do the calculations. And therefore, one variant which will be talked about, which is one variant which will be needing. Summation an, n naught I c dx, is 1 over 2 pi I, and this integral c minus I infinity to c plus I infinity, I shall truncate at c minus it to c plus it, and then I will see what is a truncation error. Therefore, this is c minus it to c plus it, f of s, x power s by s ds, and there are two error terms, or let's say E1 and E2. And the E1 is x power c divided by t into summation mod an by n power c, and E2 is x by t into maximum of mod an, when n lies between x by 2 and 2s. And now, of course, the c has to be bigger than 1, because I really want my fs to be absolutely convergent in sigma bigger than 1, and therefore always we can do the integration only in the region where it is convergent. But then c I cannot choose really arbitrarily. If I choose c really arbitrarily, this E1 will really go up, shoot anything. And therefore I should choose c to be rather small. And probably c equal to 1 is a good choice, but unfortunately, but then summation an by n may not converge. And therefore what you do is you take c to be slightly bigger than 1, so that everything can be under control. And therefore the normal choice is that c is equal to 1 plus 1 over log x, and that would minimize the E1. once you take c equal to 1 plus 1 over log x, then x power c is the same as x. Then if you get it x over t and the summation mod an by n power 1 plus 1 over log x. And since I am assuming that it's absolutely convergent in sigma bigger than 1, summation mod an by n power 1 plus 1 over log x would be convergent. And in most of the applications, it will give such powers of log x. That is not the only variant of this Perron's formula. There are other variants also. One such a variant is summation an log x by n power k minus 1 is equal to k minus 1 factorial times 1 over 2 pi I, oh God, into integral fs x power s by s power k ds. Okay, I think I missed the k. Okay, therefore k minus 1 factorial 1 over 2 pi I integral fs x power s by s power k ds. And if k is no log, like 2 or 3 or something like that, then fs into x power s by s power k is fantastically convergent, absolutely convergent, and in fact very rapidly convergent, because there's an s power k in the denominator. Since there's an s power k in the denominator, this is fantastically convergent, except for the fact that we might be interested in summation an, but this gives summation an with an extra weight, which is logarithm of x over n raised to the power k minus 1. And in fact, if ans are non-negative, then there are ways of passing from summation an into log x by n power k minus 1 to summation an itself. And that's what normally people do. And the other variant is summation an into e power minus l over x equal to 1 over 2 pi I f of s x power s gamma s ds. C minus I infinity, C plus I infinity. And this is also absolutely convergent. And in fact, I have now introduced gamma s. And I am not sure how many of the audience know what gamma s is, and therefore let me just define them. Yeah, gamma function is by definition 0 to infinity u power z minus 1 e power minus u du, and this integral is convergent when the real part of z is bigger than 0. And yeah, that's the definition. Gamma z equal to 0 to infinity u power z minus 1 e power minus u du when the real part of z is bigger than 0. And this clearly satisfies a functional equation gamma z plus 1 equal to z gamma z. And actually, then you using something called a Henkel's contour and things like that, one proves that the gamma function is actually can be extended throughout the complex plane. But actually, if you want only for, let us say, real z is bigger than or equal to minus 10, I want the gamma function to be extended, then you can just use gamma z plus 1 equal to z gamma z itself in order to really prove the analytic continuation of the gamma function up to, for example, real part of z bigger than minus 10. And also this gamma z plus 1 equal to z gamma z would imply immediately that gamma n equal to n minus 1 factorial. And in fact, that was really the motivation of Euler to define the gamma function, because you know the factorial function is defined only on integers, and he wanted to interpolate it and get a real function, which is exactly. And then you have gamma z into gamma 1 minus z equal to pi over sine pi z. This shows that gamma function never vanishes, which is something we will be using. Gamma function never vanishes. And also from the fact that gamma z plus 1 equal to z gamma z, you will be able to prove that the poles of the gamma functions are only at 0, minus 1, minus 2, minus 3, etc. And nowhere else. And in fact, again, using gamma z plus 1 equal to z gamma z, it is in fact possible to really compute what is the residue at these points. One of the important things which you will be needing about the gamma function is what is called a Stirling's approximation. It says essentially gamma z equal to square root of 2 pi into e power minus z into z power z minus half into 1 plus order of 1 over mod z. This is a very important thing for us from two different angles, which I will explain. But again, if we see the approximation, gamma z equal to square root of 2 pi e power minus z, z power z minus half, 1 plus O of 1 over mod z. And by taking z to be the integer, gamma say n plus 1, and gamma n plus 1 is n factorial, and therefore you can actually get an approximation, Stirling approximation for n factorial, which will give you something like a n plus 1 power n plus half times e power minus n and so on. We will be more interested is how the gamma for a fixed sigma, again recall sigma is a real part. That's what we are using. You are never using x plus iy at all. You are always using sigma plus it. For a fixed sigma, as mod t tends to infinity, how does the gamma function behave? You just put z equal to sigma plus it and then simplify and take the absolute value, and then you will get something like a gamma modulus of gamma of sigma plus it is square root of 2 pi times mod t power sigma minus half to e power pi by 2 into mod t. And what is most important is, therefore, this function for a fixed sigma, as t goes to infinity, this has an exponential decay. And that's very important for us, because this is something which we are going to use again and again, that this gamma function has an exponential decay. And that is exactly what makes all this earlier integrals f of x square s gamma s ds etc. to be convergent. Now we go back to Riemann zeta function. Okay, the following theorem is drawn. This is the Riemann zeta function represents a monomorphic continuation. It has only one simple pole, and the simple pole is equal to 1, and if the residue is 1, and therefore zeta s equal to, in fact, around s equal to 1, the zeta function has an expansion which looks like 1 over s minus 1 plus gamma plus c1 times s minus 1 plus c2 times s minus 1 whole square, and so on and so forth, where gamma is the Euler's constant. Therefore, this admits a monomorphic continuation with only a simple pole at s equal to 1, and it's regularly able to vary. And also, this is very important, there is something called a functional equation. Namely, if you define psi s equal to s into s minus 1 over 2 into pi power minus s by 2 into gamma s by 2 into zeta s, then this psi s is invariant under s going to 1 minus s. Therefore, psi s equal to s into s minus 1 by 2 into pi power minus s by 2 gamma s by 2 zeta s is psi s equal to psi 1 minus s. Now substitute that, which means the zeta s can be written in terms of zeta of 1 minus s, and there will be a factor, and this factor is a chi s, and you can actually write what this chi s is, because you have only s into s minus 1 over 2, which is invariant essentially under s going to 1 minus s, and then you have a pi power minus s by 2, which is formless, and therefore this chi s will actually be some quotient of gamma functions. And once it's a quotient of gamma functions, which is precisely what we are going to use, then as t goes to infinity, therefore you know the order of that. And there is one more analytic continuation, not up to the complex plane, throughout the complex plane, but to the real part of s bigger than 0, and that is given by this formula. And let me explain this formula, but I have not seen many applications of this formula. This formula says, if you take zeta s into 1 minus 1 over 2 power s, that is minus 1 power n minus 1 by n power s. Okay, why is that true? Because what you have is, on the left hand side, you have a zeta s first, zeta s into 1. Zeta s into 1 is summation 1 over n power s. Okay, therefore the denominator will have all natural numbers, and the numerator is 1. But when you take the zeta s and multiply by 1 over 2 power s, then you will get summation 1 over 2n power s. Therefore, the denominator will have all even integers, and the numerator will be 1. When you multiply it by 2, then the denominator will have even integers, and the numerator will be 2. Therefore, you have a zeta s, which has all the natural numbers with the numerator 1, and then zeta s into 2 by 2 power s, where the denominator has all the even integers with a coefficient 2, and therefore when you subtract, then all the even odd numbers will have the coefficient 1, and all the even numbers will have the coefficient 2. And why is this minus 1 power n minus 1 by n power s is really convergent to the right of 0? That is something which I will explain later, because this particular function would be useful for us when I want to talk about general Dirichlet series. Good. Now, when you have start with studying a function, the first thing which you would like to know is what are the zeros and the poles of the function. Therefore, once you have an idea about the zeros and poles, then you will. And poles we have already seen. That is only one pole, namely at s equal to 1. And now where are the zeros? You see, you go back to the function equation. This psi s is an entire function. This psi s is an entire function. And also you see, the gamma function never vanishes. And the zeta function does not vanish to the right of 1 because it has an okay. Okay, I'll come to the detail. Zeta function has no, it doesn't vanish. And therefore the psi s does not vanish to the right of 1. And the functional equation says that the psi s cannot vanish to the left of 1. And therefore, if the psi s cannot vanish to the left of 1, therefore, the only zeros of the zeta function are precisely where any other function has a pole, and the pole has to be killed by the pole zero of the zeta function. And the only other function which will have a pole is gamma s by 2. And you have already seen where gamma function has poles, and it is at 0, -1, -2, -3, etc. And therefore, gamma s by 2 has poles only when s is a -2n type thing, by negative or an even integers. And therefore, zeta function vanishes precisely there. Therefore, zeta of -2n equals 0. And no 0 to the right of 1. Yeah, that's what I claim. Therefore, let's see how to prove that. There are two ways to prove that. And number one is that it has a convergent product. And a convergent product by definition never vanishes. A product which vanishes. Okay. And the second way to prove that is something which I forgot to tell you earlier. 1 over zeta s is also a Dirichlet series. 1 over zeta s is given by summation mu(n) by n power s, where mu(n) is called so-called Mobius function, with mu(1) equal to 1, and mu(n) will be 0 if there is some p square divides n, and if no p square divides n, then mu(n) equal to -1 raised to the number of prime factors of n. And that is called the Mobius function. And since zeta function has an inverse, which is summation mu(n) by n power s, and that function is convergent to the right of 1, in fact, absolutely convergent to the right of 1, therefore, obviously, the zeta function cannot have a 0. Because if it were having a 0, then the inverse function will have a pole. Therefore, now you know the zeros to the left of the line sigma equal to 0, namely at -2n and nowhere else. And you also know that to the right of 1, there are no zeros, which means that all the other zeros have real part between 0 and 1. And the Riemann hypothesis is an assertion that if those zeros have the real part exactly equal to half. Okay, but are there zeros? How many zeros are there anyway between the real part between 0 and 1? And that's the theorem of Van-Mangold. The number of zeros equal to t by 2 pi log t by 2 pi minus t by 2 pi plus O of log t. This has a corollary, which I will be using sometimes, that the number of zeros between the ordinate t and the ordinate t plus h is O of log t for any fixed h. That's exactly what, because you can write the formula for n of t and n of t plus h, and you can subtract. And when you subtract n of t and n of t plus h, then you get t by 2 pi log t by 2 pi minus t by 2 pi. You will put the t plus h and subtract to get O of t. Okay. And from in what follows, I will denote by rho a 0 of zeta function, and the beta to be the real part of rho, and the gamma to be the imaginary part of rho. Therefore, whenever I write rho is equal to beta plus I gamma, and then this rho is a 0, and beta is its real part, and gamma its imaginary part. Now, what do we know? See, of course, if Riemann hypothesis were known, that there's no problem at all, because we know all the zeros lie on the half line, and we can perfectly okay. But since Riemann equality is not known, therefore, what is the question which we, what are the things which we know about the zeros? Okay. The first result is that 1 minus beta is bigger than c times log mod t power minus 2/3 into log mod t power minus 1/3 if mod t is bigger than 10. Let me mention a few things about this. This means, you see, as t goes to infinity, the right hand side goes to 0. Therefore, we do not even know that to the right of beta equal to 0.99, there are no zeros is something which we cannot prove. The maximum which we can prove is that there is a curve which is asymptotic to the line 1, because as t goes to infinity, this curve goes to 1. And to the right of the curve, therefore, the beta is always less than 1 minus constant times log mod t power 2/3 minus 2/3 and log t power minus 1/3, only in a very small strip. That strip does not contain 0. That's all we know. And then there are something called density results, which means, okay, I cannot prove that there are no zeros to the right of 1, but on the other hand, at least I can prove that there are not too many zeros to the right of 1. Therefore, even though I cannot prove that there are no zeros to the right of 1, I can prove that there are not too many zeros to the right of 1, and such results are called the density results. Therefore, let me define n alpha t is the number of zeros which are to the right of alpha and with a height t. Therefore, the number of zeros to the right of alpha with a height t, that is called n alpha t. Therefore, that is zeta plus beta gamma equal to 0. Then there exists a constant a such that n alpha t is order of t power a into 1 minus alpha. Therefore, it says that, okay, I cannot prove that there are no zeros, but the number of zeros is not too many. It is just t power a into 1 minus alpha. And one can take a equal to 12 over 5 plus epsilon. That's the best that is known now. And what is expected is 2 plus epsilon. And 2 plus epsilon is what you would expect, essentially, because you can take alpha equal to half, for example. And if you take alpha equal to half, then you know already there are t log t zeros. And therefore, the t log t has to be O of t power a to 1 minus alpha. And at alpha equal to half, then this has to be true, will more or less force your a to be 2 plus epsilon. Okay. For some, let me talk about a general Dirichlet series now, and then we'll come to zeta function in particular. What is a general Dirichlet series? General Dirichlet series, by definition, a summation an into e power minus lambda n into s, where lambda n is an increasing function of n. And any increasing function of lambda. For example, you can take lambda n equal to log n and an equal to 1. And if you take lambda n equal to log n and an equal to 1, this is precisely the Riemann zeta function. E power minus log n power s, which is n power minus s. But it doesn't really matter what lambda n you choose, essentially, because they will sort of behave almost similar. And let's take lambda n equal to n. When you take lambda n equal to n, then the function which you have is summation an e power minus ns. And this function is related to capital F of z, which is summation an z power n, z equal to e power minus s. Therefore, if you have a general Dirichlet series with the lambda n equal to n, then a general Dirichlet series is sort of corresponds to a power series, which essentially means that for a general Dirichlet series, what are the properties that you would expect? You can more or less say that, okay, move to power series, and in power series, I know what to expect, and I can as well do. And that is more or less true. For example, a power series has a circle of convergence. And see, now you see the transformation z going to e power minus s. Therefore, z is in a circle. Essentially means that e power minus s is in a straight line. And therefore, the correspondingly, therefore, any fs will have a line of convergence, sigma c. And the circle of convergence, any power series is convergent at every point inside the circle of convergence. and it is not convergent at every point outside the circle of convergence. And now you take z equal to e power minus s and do that, which means that your Dirichlet series is convergent to the right of every point on the line of convergence, and it's not convergent to the left of any point. This is rather very important, because now, in order to know whether it is a Dirichlet series, what is the line of convergence, it is sufficient to look at the real points alone. And in the real points, you move from the right to the left and see till what time it is convergent, and that will be the line of convergence. Okay? Because once you have defined the line of convergence and say that to the right of every point it will be convergent, and to the left of the, at every point to the right it will be convergent, at every point to the left it will not be convergent, then it is actually sufficient for you to restrict your attention just to the real line, and then just see what is the convergence. And that's exactly what I used when I was talking about summation minus 1 power n minus 1 by n power s. Because in this particular case, as far as the real line is concerned, you know that this series is convergent to the right of 0, and not convergent obviously to the left of 0. And now this general theory tells you that if you know already what happens on the real line, then you know everything on the complex plane, and therefore this function is analytic to the right of 0, and it's not convergent to the left of 0. That's exactly what I said. That if you take summation an e power minus lambda ns, then this is convergent to the right of, if sigma is bigger than sigma c, and it's not convergent if sigma is less than sigma c. Therefore, this theory, as you see, is parallel to the theory of power series. Therefore, the theory of Dirichlet series is parallel to the theory of power series with some difference. Okay, let's see some differences. Yeah, this is the other point which I just explained. In order to get what is the line of convergence, you can take t equal to 0. I mean, therefore, you have to just argue on the real line. You need not do anything, just argue on the real. Now, define sigma a to be the line of convergence of summation mod a n e power minus lambda. So I have to go to the absolute value now. And then, you know, in a power series, a circle of convergence is the same as circle of absolute convergence. If you take, therefore, if you take a circle of convergence, I mean the region where it is convergent, then at the inside the circle, at every point, it is in fact absolutely convergent. Okay, but on the other hand, this is the example which I gave. F of s equal to summation minus 1 power n minus 1 by n power s, which is 1 minus 1 over 2 by 2 power s into zeta s. This has convergent to the right of 0. But if you take the absolute value, it is convergent only to the right of 1. Therefore, the line of convergence is not the same as the line of absolutely convergence. The difference is as big as 1. And it is in fact possible to prove that the maximum difference can be 1. And it cannot be more than 1. There is one main difference between the power series and Dirichlet series, that the convergence automatically need not imply the absolute convergence. And the second thing is, for a power series, the circle of convergence always has a singularity, which is also not true for Dirichlet series. Again, the same example, we take minus 1 power n minus 1 by n power s. This has no singularity on sigma equal to 0, because this is just a 1 minus 2 power 1 minus s into zeta s, and zeta s has no singularity on sigma equal to 0. It has only one singularity, it is equal to 1. However, this is something which I will be using in the next lecture. If ANs are non-negative, then on the line of convergence, there will be a singularity. And in fact, the real point on the line of convergence would be a singularity. The real point on the line of convergence would be a singularity. Good. Up to that, is it anything? Is it everything is okay, or yeah? Now, because now I want to change the things and go to lecture 2, and these are now things where I plan to give a proof and go a little more slowly, and therefore I would like to Saurabh, is it okay?
Yes, sir, it is okay, sir.
Okay, any comments? No, so far no comments, no?
No, sir, so far no questions. Yes, sir.
Oh, okay. Now we'll go to lecture 2, which is Rangman law principle. We'll just come in a minute. Yeah, now I want to explain a certain results of Ramchandra, and therefore I intend to go a little slowly to even possibly giving the proof and so on and so forth. First of all, it is known that zeta function is bounded on the vertical strips. Bounded meaning bounded as a power of t. In particular, if you take zeta sigma plus it and you write O of mod t power a and take the infimum over a, and that exists. Okay, and that infimum is normally denoted by mu sigma. In other words, zeta of sigma plus it is O of mod t power mu sigma plus epsilon, and it is not O of t power mod t power mu sigma minus epsilon. And we would like to draw the graph of mu sigma. How this mu sigma will look like. Mu sigma is continuous, that is obvious from the definition. And if sigma is bigger than 1, zeta function is convergent. Since therefore it is bounded. And that essentially means mu sigma has to be 0 if sigma bigger than 1. And now we go to, therefore sigma bigger than 1, we know it, the value is mu sigma equal to 0. And now what happens to the left of 0? I can use a functional equation. The functional equation will give you, as we have already seen, zeta s equal to chi s into zeta 1 minus s, and we can write it explicitly, which will give you zeta of 1 minus sigma plus it is around mod t power, oh god, it's not equality, mod t around mod t power sigma minus 1 into zeta of sigma plus it. It's not equality. That will prove that mu sigma equal to half minus sigma when sigma is less than 0. Therefore, we know the mu sigma when sigma is less than 0. We know mu sigma when sigma is bigger than 1. What we are interested in knowing, what is mu sigma in between. Therefore, if you have a between when sigma lies between 0 and 1, what is the value of mu sigma? And one trivial consequence is the so-called Hardy's first approximation theorem. Let me make some mention of a little more about that. It says that if 0 is less than sigma less than 1, zeta of sigma plus it is summation n not exceeding capital T 1 over L power sigma plus it plus O of t power minus sigma, where capital T is of the same order as the little t. Let me just explain what this means. You know, summation 1 over n power sigma plus it gives you zeta of sigma plus it when you are in the region of convergence. Now, this theorem of Hardy says that even when you are not in the region of convergence, then if you truncate it at an appropriate place, therefore, even if you are not in the region of convergence, but if you truncate it in an appropriate place, then this function, this truncation would approximate zeta of sigma plus it. And then, you see, once the right-hand side is not convergent, you cannot say that I will truncate at any large arbitrary place. Okay, because once it's a divergent series, then that won't make sense. Therefore, what you have to do is to truncate it around a point which is the same order as the ordinate of the point. Therefore, your capital T should be of the same order as little t. And we will little later see something called approximate functional equation, where the result will be stronger in one sense, but weaker in the other sense, that it will not be depending upon a point t of the order little t. It will depend precisely on little t, which will give you some problem, but later. Okay, anyway. Therefore, we know that zeta of sigma plus it is equal to summation n not exceeding t 1 over n power sigma plus it. Practically, because there's an error, which is O of t power minus sigma, and we can forget that. Now I can take a trivial estimate. Therefore, summation, the right hand side is summation 1 over n power sigma plus it, and therefore trivially estimated summation n not exceeding t 1 over n power sigma I can write, and that is of the order t power 1 minus sigma, and consequently you get mu sigma is less than 1 minus sigma. This is something valid to the in between, but as you can clearly see that this is rather a very weak estimate, and in fact at sigma equal to 0, if you give you the mu 0 is less than or equal to 1, whereas I know already the exact value of mu 0 to be 0.5. Therefore, this essentially says that the mu sigma exists and bounded by 1 minus sigma, but does not give you the optimal value. And of course, we still don't know the absolute value. But the theorem which I want to prove is a so-called Pareto law principle, is that mu sigma is a convex function. Okay, therefore, let me explain what mu sigma is a convex function means. Therefore, if I now take 3 points, sigma 1, sigma 2, and the middle point sigma 0, and then plot this curve mu sigma. Therefore, I have this point sigma 1 comma mu sigma 1, and I have this point sigma 2 comma mu sigma 2, and then this point sigma 0 mu sigma 0. It says that the point sigma 0 mu sigma 0 lies below the line joining sigma 1 mu sigma 1 and sigma 2 mu sigma 2. Therefore, if you have the value at sigma 1 and the value at sigma 2, you just plot the graph sigma 1 mu sigma 1, sigma 2 mu sigma 2, take the line joining them, and then the value at any intermediate point sigma will lie strictly below the line joining sigma 1 and sigma 2. In mathematical terms, this simply means that mu sigma naught is less than or equal to sigma 2 minus sigma naught into mu sigma 1 plus sigma naught minus sigma 1 into mu sigma 2 divided by sigma 2 minus sigma 1. That's exactly what would happen. Therefore, if you really take the point sigma 1 mu sigma 1, sigma 2 mu sigma 2, and take the straight line joining them and see where it meets the sigma, what is the corresponding point for sigma naught, this will be the right hand side will be the corresponding point of sigma naught. And now when you say that sigma naught mu sigma naught lies below that, that means mu sigma naught is less than or equal to sigma 2 minus sigma naught mu sigma 1 plus sigma naught minus sigma 1 mu sigma 2 by sigma 2 minus sigma 1. Therefore, this is exactly what I want to prove now, and that would give you an idea of how mu sigma behaves between 0 and 1. Okay, let's start with the naive approach. What's the naive approach? I have this point sigma naught plus it naught, and I want to estimate the value of zeta function at this particular point, sigma naught plus it naught, and I know the value on the line sigma 1, and I know the value on the line sigma 2. You just take this rectangle and you apply maximum modulus principle. And when you apply maximum modulus principle, then of course the value at the sigma naught line would be bounded by the maximum on the sigma 1 line and the sigma 2 line, and as well as the two horizontal lines L1 and L2. That's exactly what the naive approach is. And this naive approach, of course, fails. The reason why the naive approach fails is that the only information which we have on the zeta function essentially is this Hardy's approximation, which is mu sigma is less than 1 minus sigma. And if that is the information which you want to use, then the small values of sigma will dominate. And which means the value at L4 will dominate. The value at L2 will not dominate. And the value at L3 and L4 also will, L1 and L3 also will give you some trouble. And the better method, as was suggested by Fregeman and Landau, is not to take the zeta function, but zeta function with a weight. Take the function f of s. This is zeta s into gamma s minus s naught plus 1 into x power s naught, s minus s naught. As this capital X is a real constant, which is in fact by definition T naught power C, where C is equal to mu sigma 1 minus mu sigma 2 by sigma 2 minus sigma 1. And therefore now just check in all our application, mu sigma 1 will be bigger than mu sigma 2. And therefore the C will be positive, which we will use in a minute. Therefore that is a function f of s which we are taking. Now of course you may wonder, I am trying to estimate the zeta function at S0. But now I said that since it's difficult to evaluate the zeta function at S0, I am going to consider some other function fs and evaluate it at S0. But what's the point? The point is the value of f S0 is the same as the value of zeta as s. Because gamma s minus S0 plus 1, when you put s equal to S0, this gives you gamma 1, which is equal to 1. And x power s minus S0, when you put s equal to S0, gives you 1. And therefore, whether you want to evaluate f of S0 or whether you want to evaluate zeta of S0, both are same. But then looking at this f of S0 has an advantage. Let's see. Therefore, what we have is the value of f of S0 is bounded by the maximum value at L1 plus the value at L2 plus the maximum value at L3 plus the maximum value at L4. You take the maximum and that's what it is. And now let's do the L1 results first. In L1, you see, your S0 is here and your S is in L1. If S is in L1, then you see the real part of S minus S0 is at least T0 by 2. Sorry, the imaginary part of S minus S0 is at least T0 by 2. And once the imaginary part of S minus S0 is at least T0 by 2, and since you have a gamma function, and we have already seen that the gamma function has an exponential decay in terms of its imaginary part, and therefore this gamma function will give you e power minus T0 by 2. And if it's e power minus T0 by 2, then the zeta function is going to give you a maximum power of t, and x power s minus S0 is also going to give you a maximum power of t, and consequently the value of this function fs in L1 is negligible. Okay. Therefore, let me repeat, because this is an important point, that it is not even necessary to know what the zeta is, the bound for zeta is. I need not even know the Hartley's bound or zeta is, namely order of mod t power 1 minus sigma. If I just know that it is something like a mod t power 10 or mod t power 50, that is good enough for us. Because now there is a gamma function. This gamma of s minus S0 and gamma function has an exponential decay. Since gamma function has an exponential decay, therefore gamma of s minus S0, since the real part of since the imaginary part of s minus S0 is at least bigger than T0 by 2, the gamma function would take care of it. And the same argument will work for L3 also. In L3 also, you can see that even S belongs to L3, and if S0 is sigma naught plus IT0, then the imaginary part of s minus S0 is at least T0, and once the imaginary part is at least T0, and it has an exponential decay, the whole thing disappears. Therefore, the L3 also disappears. Therefore, just by putting, that is the purpose that was done for putting the gamma function. Once you put the gamma function, then the contributions from the horizontals just disappears. And it's only the contributions from the verticals that you will remain. Now let's do the contribution from the vertical. Now let's look at this line, L4. In L4, gamma function is always bounded. Therefore, I can forget the gamma function. In fact, the very purpose of introducing the gamma function is over. The very purpose of introducing the gamma function is that this L1 and L3 will not contribute anything. Okay, and that is taken care of. And therefore, now I can forget the gamma function. And since the gamma function is bounded, therefore, when I am now estimating the f of s on the line L2 as well as the line L4, I will forget the gamma function. On the line L4, zeta function is bounded by t power mu sigma 1. That's the definition of mu sigma. On the line sigma 1, it is bounded by t power, I'm forgetting the epsilons. If you forget the epsilon, then on the line L4, zeta function is bounded by t power mu sigma 1, and the x power s minus s naught is bounded by x power, I take the absolute value, and then absolute value of z power, a power z, as all you know, is named as a power x, a power the real part of z. Since absolute value of a power z is equal to a power real part of z, therefore the absolute value of x power s minus s naught is really x power sigma minus sigma naught. And x power sigma minus sigma naught, so sigma 1 minus sigma naught. Now remember, as I was always telling that in all our applications, the contribution from L4 will be much bigger than the contribution from L2. Therefore, if I had named, that's also very clear for the Hardy's approximation, because it gives a contribution like a 1 minus sigma. And therefore, when sigma is small, that gives a big contribution. When sigma is large, that gives a small contribution. But on the other hand, if I have not used this x power s minus s naught, and if I have just used the maximum modulus principle without that, then the contribution for L4 will be rather big, and the contribution from L2 will be rather small. And anyway, therefore, the L2 will not play a role at all, and I cannot get a convexity result. It will be the only L4 which will be dominating. And that's exactly the purpose which is done by this x power s minus s naught. When I do this x power s minus s naught, then its absolute value is nothing but x power sigma 1 minus sigma naught. And sigma 1 minus sigma naught, remember, is negative. And x is a positive power of t. Since x is a positive power of t and sigma 1 minus sigma naught is negative, therefore that pulls down the estimate on L4. The x pulls down the estimate on L4. Of course, it will increase the estimate on L2, but that doesn't really matter because L2 is originally very small. And that's exactly what happens. Therefore, on the line L4, the function f of s is bounded by t power mu sigma 1 times x power sigma 1 minus sigma naught. That's what exactly I have written. T power mu sigma 1 into x power sigma 1 minus sigma 1. And for the same reason, the value, the maximum on the line L2 is order of t naught power mu sigma 2 into x power sigma 2 minus sigma. Then the obvious thing is the choice of x you have to make in such a way that these two estimates coincide. And that's exactly what we have done earlier, the way the choice of x. And that gives you precisely mod zeta s naught is bigger than t power mu sigma 2 into sigma naught minus sigma 1 plus mu sigma 1 into sigma 2 minus sigma 1 naught by sigma 2 minus sigma 1. That's exactly what I said. Therefore, now you have this convexity. And therefore, now what you have something, you have the value, you have the value at 0, you have the value at 1, and then you can use the convexity and it gives you the value at any point. For example, at 0, the value is half, and at 1, the value is 0, and therefore, obviously, the value at half, the point half, will be 1/4. And this is called a convexity result. And if you can beat the 1/4, that will be called a subconvexity result. Okay. Good. Now, from this, I want to deduce that mu sigma is non-negative always. Once I know that it is 0 to the right of 0, it is non-negative always, and that is an obvious statement. But anyway, I will give you a proof because I am going to use something very similar to that in a few minutes. For example, let's take an example. Suppose mu 0 is equal to -1. Therefore, the value at 0 is -1, let's say. Then I know the value, and already the value of mu sigma equal to 0 when sigma is bigger than 1. Therefore, mu sigma equal to 0 at 2, mu sigma equal to 0 at 4. Okay, but now I am going to ignore the fact that mu sigma equal to 0 at 2. I am going to use the fact that mu sigma equal to 0 at 4. And now I know that the value at 4 I know, the value at 0 I know. Once I know the value at 0 and I know the value at 4, I can use the convexity to get the value at 2. Okay, and I know the value at 4 is 0. I know the value at 0 is -1. Once I know the value at 0 is -1 and the value at 4 is 0, then the value at 2 has to be less than -half. Therefore, it has to be negative. Okay, that's what precisely what convexity will tell you. That if mu0 equal to -1 and mu of 4 equal to 0, then I can take the line joining the points 0 and -1 and as well as 4, 0. And then I have to see the straight line and I have to look at the value at 2 and then I have to go below the straight line and therefore mu at 2 will be less than -half and therefore in particular it is less than 0. But that's obviously a contradiction because mu2 equal to 0. Okay, and therefore from this contradiction we do seem to get that mu sigma is always greater than or equal to 0. Number 2, this result is a local result. What do I mean local? Suppose you assume that theta sigma 1 plus it equal to mod t power mu sigma 1 plus epsilon, which is what we assumed earlier. But now I am not assuming it for all t. I am only assuming it for t in the neighborhood of t naught. Therefore, let's take t belongs to t naught minus log square t naught to plus log square t naught. And similarly for theta sigma 2 plus it also. I am going to assume theta sigma 2 plus it is the model of mod t to mu power sigma 2 plus epsilon. But on the other hand, again, I am not going to assume it for all t. I am going to assume it only for the neighborhood of t naught, namely when t lies between t naught minus log square t and t naught plus log square t. Even then, I can prove that zeta sigma naught plus it naught is equal to O of mod t power mu sigma naught, where mu sigma naught is already defined. I mean, mu sigma naught is not the correct word there. Whatever that you get is there by the convexity. Namely, what I should have written is that sigma 2 minus sigma 1 to mu sigma naught plus etc. which we have written. The proof is rather clear. The proof is rather clear because I am going to do the same fragment. I am going to take the same fs which I had to earlier, S0, and I am going to take a rectangle with the left hand side is on the line sigma 1, the right hand side is on the line sigma 2, and the height is log square t naught, and that is good enough for me because once I have the gamma function, and therefore the horizontal contribution will disappear because the imaginary inequality is log square t naught. Once the imaginary inequality is log square t naught and it has an exponential decay, therefore any power of t will be killed. And in the left hand side, I need the information on sigma 1 only for this interval t naught minus log square t naught to t naught plus log square t naught. Similarly, on the right hand side, I need the information on the line sigma 1, sigma 2 only between t naught minus log square t naught to t naught plus log square t naught. Therefore, this information which I need is a local resource. Therefore, once I have an information where for a small neighborhood, once I have the bound, then I am already through, I can put that. Let me make just one more comment and then I will go to the result of Ramchandra. One more comment is this: what is this purpose which are defined by the gamma s plus 1? The purpose of gamma s plus 1 is that the value is 1 at s equal to 0, which we used very much. And then we also use the fact that it has an exponential. And therefore, any function which has a value at 1 at s equal to 0, and it has an exponential decay for a fixed sigma and as t goes to infinity. If as t goes to infinity for a fixed sigma, if it has an exponential decay, then that function is good enough. And for example, e power s square is also an equally good nice function. And probably in the classical literature, I think e power s square was used more than the gamma function. Because this is also a function which has a value at 1 at s equal to 0, and it also has an exponential decay. And in fact, I have not written, but you know, Ramchandra also was fond of a certain other kernel which has not a single exponential decay, which has a double exponential decay. And once it has a double exponential decay, then you do not, for example, in the previous theorem, you do not even need the information up to a length log square t naught. Even if you have an information only up to a length log t naught whole square, that is good enough because that function would actually eat away the contributions from the horizontals. And those things will make it more complicated. Therefore, let's not draw. With this introduction, I want to talk about one result of Ramachandra. This is the observation by Ramachandra. And this observation is that what this pregnant under that, which says that this mu sigma is convex, holds not only for the L infinite norm, it also holds for the L1 norm. Therefore, if you have a bound for the L1 norm on the line sigma 1 and a bound on the L1 norm on the line sigma 2, then you can get a bound on the line sigma naught, and that bound will be precisely the convex bound. And how Ramachandra used it is a question will come later. Therefore, let me state the theorem. Okay. The theorem is therefore let H be a T power alpha for any fixed alpha. You fix an alpha, alpha may be very small, 0.01. Okay, and you fix an alpha, and now assume that you have an L1 norm on the line sigma 1. Therefore, 1 over H T minus H to T plus H zeta of sigma 1 plus IT dt is O of T power mu1 sigma 1 plus epsilon, because since it is now the L1 norm, I am calling mu1. And similarly, let's assume that on the line sigma 2 you have an L1 norm. Therefore, 1 over H T minus H T plus H mod zeta of sigma 2 plus IT dt is T power mu1 sigma 2 plus epsilon. Then the L1 norm at, oh God, 1 over H I have forgotten. Now 1 over H, okay, I should have written, sorry, 1 over H T to T plus H mod zeta of sigma plus IT is O of T power mu1 sigma 1 plus epsilon, where mu1 sigma naught is exactly what you would expect, namely mu1 sigma 2 into sigma naught minus sigma 1 plus mu1 sigma 1 into sigma 2 minus sigma naught by sigma 2 minus sigma 1. Therefore, you have this, if you have a bound on the L1 norm on the line sigma 1, and if you have a bound on the L1 norm on the line sigma 2, then you can actually get a bound on the line sigma naught. Yeah, it should have been 1 over H. I'm sorry for that. It should be 1 over H T to T plus H zeta of sigma plus IT. And let me make a couple of more comments before this. Number one, again, this is local. That's exactly the reason why I was insisting on the fact that it's local. I mean, I am not assuming anything beyond that. And number two, the assumptions regarding the range of integration is a little stronger than the conclusion. The range of integration, I am assuming the range to be of a length 3h, T minus H to T plus H. Whereas in the conclusion, I am assuming that the range to be of the order H. Okay? Therefore, there will be some loss. Okay, but this for analytic number theories, 3h and h etc. are all same. It doesn't really matter. And I need a little bigger range in the assumption, essentially because I want gamma function to kill something. And once you want gamma function to kill something, then you always need the imaginary part to be log, and that's what it is. And therefore, let me give the proof of it. Therefore, we are assuming that 1 over H T minus H T plus H is 2 of T power mu1 sigma 1 plus epsilon. 1 over H T minus H T plus 2H is 1 over T power mu1 sigma 2 plus epsilon. Then I will get 1 over H T to T plus H, zeta of sigma naught plus IT is T power mu1 sigma naught plus epsilon. Let's give the proof. See, earlier we were estimating the value at the middle point by maximum modulus principle. Since once you do the value at the middle point by the maximum modulus principle, then the L infinity norm of all the four sides will come. And now, but on the other hand, I know only L1 norm now. And therefore, I am not going to evaluate the value at the midpoint in terms of using maximum modulus principle, but I am going to use the Cauchy's theorem of the sequence. Therefore, the zeta of sigma naught plus IT would be 1 over 2 pi I integral over this rectangle f of s by s power sigma naught plus IT. Okay, and the same f of s which we had here. And this has a pole, the integral has a pole at s equal to sigma naught plus IT, which will give you zeta of sigma naught plus IT. Oh, I should have done modulus, but that's okay. Now, and what is this function? F of s by s power s minus sigma naught plus IT. F of s we have defined already to be zeta s into gamma s minus s naught plus 1 x power s minus s naught by s minus s naught. But the gamma of s minus s naught plus 1 by s minus s naught is the same as gamma of s minus s naught. We call gamma z plus 1 equal to z gamma z. And therefore, the function which we are integrating is actually zeta s into gamma s minus s naught into x power s minus s naught. I could have started with that, but I just wanted to say why it comes. And remember, now this function zeta s into gamma s minus s naught into x power s minus s naught has a pole at s equal to s naught coming from the gamma function, and that gives you the mean. And therefore, the zeta function now can be estimated as 1 over 2 pi I into L1 norm of at L2 and as well as L1 norm at L4. And now this is the point which I want to say, that my estimate on sigma naught is only between t and t plus h. Therefore, my t lies between t and t plus h. My t lies between t and t plus h, but the rectangles is on the line t minus h and t plus 2h. And that's exactly the reason why I needed the information from t minus 2h to t plus 2h. And now the t naught, if the t is lies between t and t plus h, then the imaginary part of z, and if s belongs to L1, and if then the imaginary part of s minus s naught is at least as big as h. And once the imaginary part is s minus s naught is as big as h, and because of it in the exponential decay, as we said earlier, the integral on the L1 will disappear. That's why I always, when I want to integrate between t to t plus h, I don't take this rectangle with the horizontals at t and t plus h. I take the rectangles with the horizontals at t minus h and t plus 2h, so that the gamma function will take care of the contributions from the rectangle, from the horizontals. The horizontals would be at a distance of log h, and the gamma s minus s naught has an exponential decay, and therefore that will take care. And therefore what you have is left with only the integrals on L2 and L4. And that's exactly what we said. Therefore, on the L2, it is x power s minus s naught will give you x power sigma 1 minus sigma naught, integral t minus h to t plus h, zeta of sigma 1 plus it, integral gamma of sigma 1 minus sigma naught plus I into t minus t naught dt. I have written what exactly my function fs is. Fs is zeta s into gamma of s minus s naught into x power s minus s naught, and that function I have written explicitly and integrating between t minus h and t plus h. This x power s minus s naught gives you an x power sigma 1 minus sigma naught, and the zeta s gives you the zeta of sigma 1 plus it, and the gamma s minus s naught gives you gamma sigma 1 minus sigma naught plus I into t minus t naught dt. And it's exactly the similar thing on the line L2 also. Therefore, all the sigma 1 will get replaced by sigma 2. And now I can integrate with respect to t naught. I integrate with respect to t naught, therefore I will get a t to t plus h, zeta of sigma naught plus it naught. I have already a bound for zeta of sigma naught plus it naught in the previous line. Since I have a bound on the for zeta of sigma naught plus it naught in the previous line, I can just use that bound and integrate from t to t plus h, and then I can interchange the integration. Now, once I interchange the integration, then I get x power sigma 1 minus sigma naught. Then I will get a t minus h to t plus 2h mod zeta of sigma 1 plus it. Oh, there's no mod square. I'm sorry. Just zeta of mod sigma 1 plus it, there's no square. And integral t to t plus h, gamma of sigma 1 minus sigma naught plus I into t minus t naught dt. Now the gamma function, as you know, is bounded. And it's also bounded, unless it is close to the pole. And it is exponential decay. And this sigma 1 minus sigma naught plus I into t minus t naught is not close to the pole. Okay, the poles are only at 0, minus 1, minus 2, minus 3, etc. And it has an exponential decay. Therefore, the gamma integral just disappears. Gamma integral is bounded. Now the gamma integral is bounded. And therefore, what you get is x power sigma 1 minus sigma naught into t power mu1 into sigma 1. That's exactly what you get at this t minus h to t plus 2h mod zeta of sigma 1 plus it whole square by definition is bounded by h times t power mu1 sigma 1. And now the same thing for sigma 2, x power sigma 2 minus sigma naught into h into t power mu 1 sigma 2. And choose x in such a way that these two terms are equal, and that gives you precisely the convexity. Therefore, the same proof which we had earlier for the Pragmatic, except instead of using maximum modulus principle, if you use now Cauchy's theorem on residues, then it gives the value of the integral in terms of the L1 norm of the verticals, and write that L1 norm of the verticals, and then integrate, and then integrate the summation, you get this. Now, why do we need that? Therefore, this gives a corollary, mu1 sigma is always non-negative. This is exactly what we did for the mu sigma, because once you have the convexity and the value is 0 to the right of 1, which is also true in this case, so L1 norm also, then mu1 sigma is better. This is equivalent to saying t to t plus h, modulus of zeta of sigma plus it whole square. Oh God, again the square is not that. Mod zeta of sigma plus it dt is bigger than h. Okay, I will say I'm much more doing more on the L2 norm, and therefore I just the square appears without my real knowledge. It is zeta of sigma 1 plus it. Therefore, the L1 norm of zeta function in from t to t plus h is bigger than alpha h. And this is true for not only zeta function. I have never used any properties of zeta function. Take any zeta, any an by n power s. If you take an by n power s with the a1 equal to 1 and an equal to a bounded by a power of a, then the same thing is true. Let me finish with an application. Okay. This application is something which I plan to talk about in little more detail in the next lecture. And therefore, let me just say zeta s, you write as chi s into zeta 1 minus s. And therefore, replacing s by 1 minus s, you get zeta of 1 minus s equal to chi 1 minus s into zeta s. And that gives you chi s into chi 1 minus s equal to 1. And in particular, chi of half plus it into chi of half minus it is 1. But chi of half plus it and chi of half minus it are complex conjugates, and their product is 1, which means the chi of half plus it is a number like a e power I theta t. And now you define g of t equal to e power minus I theta 2 by zeta s, and then substitute it. And once you do that, then at all the line half of plus it, then what happens is this gt is also equal to its complex conjugate, and therefore the g2 is actually a real function of t. And now I want to prove that the gt value changes sign infinitely often. Therefore, and reduce therefore gt vanishes something. And in order to prove that the gt changes sign infinitely often, what we want to prove is that integral t to t plus h mod gt dt, and then integral t to t plus h gt dt modulus, these two numbers are not equal. If these two numbers are not equal, that means gt cannot maintain the same sign. And if gt does not maintain the same sign, then gt has to be 0. That's exactly what I want to prove. And therefore, now both sides are there. How do I prove that? What the normal idea is essentially to prove that the left-hand side is rather big and the right-hand side is rather small. And again, you have to prove both the statements. You have to prove the statement that the left-hand side is big. You have to prove the statement that the right-hand side is small. But now, because of this Ramachandra theorem, that the left-hand side is big follows trivially, because mod gt is essentially gt is only an extra e power minus I theta by 2. Mod gt is essentially the zeta function. And once you have essentially the zeta function, it has a lower bound which is bigger than h. Therefore, that part there is nothing for you to prove. It just follows from Ramachandra's thing. And then the other part is, of course, t to t plus gt dt is small is what you have to prove. And that, of course, will be a different ballgame. Okay, finally, back to Pragmatic, because I wanted to talk about Ramachandra's work, but on the other hand, I started with Pragmatic and I said that I am now trying to draw the graph of mu sigma. Therefore, with this, what do I know? We have mu 0 equal to half. We have mu 1 equal to 0. Consequently, mu half is lesser or equal to 1/4. And of course, that is not the best that is known. Much better results are known, like 0.155. And what is expected is mu half equal to 0. And if mu half equal to 0, and mu sigma equal to 0 when sigma is bigger than or equal to 1. Then by convexity, mu sigma equal to 0 all sigma bigger than or equal to half. And once mu sigma is bigger than 0 plus sigma bigger than or equal to half, again by the function equation, mu sigma is equal to half minus sigma for all sigma less than or equal to half. And this particular statement that mu sigma equal to 0 for sigma bigger than or equal to half, and consequently mu sigma equal to half minus sigma when sigma is less than or equal to half is known as a Riemann hypothesis. And it is known that the Riemann hypothesis implies Riemann hypothesis, where I say intend to give a proof. And I think I will stop here. I'll stop time.
Yeah. Thank you, Balu, for your wonderful talk. So I guess we have some time for questions, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so if you have any question, anyone, you can unmute and ask directly. No? I think there are no questions in the chat also, no? Sort of, are there questions in the chat?
Now you can see the chat.
No, sir, there was no
There's
question
no
in the
question.
chat.
Okay, so I think the lecture was clear enough to everyone. So yeah, it was great. I think you have pitched it correctly. So
Ready?
I think you have, oh, there is one question here. Is there something analogous for L2?
Analogous in what sense? Yeah, probably you can unmute and ask me. Oh, your mic. Okay, by analogous for L2, you mean you want to say whether they have a lower bound of that time. Is that what you want? Yeah. Okay. In fact, the answer is yes, because suppose you want to do the L2 for the zeta square S, you can take Fs itself as zeta square S. Then the L1 norm of zeta square S is the same as the L2 norm for zeta. Okay, and therefore that is that's not a problem at all. And in fact, what Ramchandra did was essentially he took f of s equal to zeta s power k, and then got this lower bound. And okay, let me withdraw that statement. I will talk about it tomorrow. But on the other hand, as far as L2 is concerned, you can do actually a little more. Okay, which is going to be the topic for the next lecture, where I am going to take L2. Suppose you have T to T plus H, summation an by n power s mod square dt. And this is not only bigger than constant times H, you can even gain a little more. Constant times H into summation mod an square by n. Okay, and that's going to be the subject matter for the next lecture.
Okay. So anything else? Any other questions? No? Okay, in that case, let's thank the speaker.
Thank you.
Okay, so we will start at 11:15, the next
11.
talk.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So I'll just pass it to Saurabh then, if you have any announcement to make. Saurabh.
I think मुझे होस्ट बना दो, होस्ट मुझे ट्रांसफर करता है. Okay, so let us take a 15-minute break and we will meet at 11:10.